Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the ARA's latest research report, Value of Rail 2020. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting as yet, my name is Caroline Wilkie, CEO of the Australasian Railway Association. It's fantastic to have so many of you joining us here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. For me, based here in Canberra, that is the Ngunnawal people, and I pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's very exciting to have you all here today for the launch of this fantastic report. There are so many facts in there about our industry. It's a fantastic read and I encourage you all to read it right the way through. The Value of Rail report that we're launching today was developed in partnership with Deloitte Access Economics and explores the significant economic and social contributions of rail here in Australia. The release of today's report forms a central part of the ARA's significant ongoing research agenda to deliver a detailed and robust evidence base to support our work driving reform on the key issues facing our members. The ARA is unashamedly focused on championing the benefits of rail, not only to the economics, but social and community across Australia. Today's Value of Rail report really highlights the important contribution to our industry. Whether you be in passenger, freight, construction or manufacturing, we have sections in this report for each of the sections of our membership. From the early days when our cities and towns were built around the local railway station, the rail industry has been a critical part of the economy and community. It has long been part of our daily commute, our trade access across the country and the growth of our nation. As we look beyond 2020, it is clear rail remains as important as ever. This year's Value of Rail report highlights the growing role of rail in our daily lives. More people rely on rail industry than they did just a few years ago, as the rise in rail projects attracts new employees across the country. The report shows that while the face of rail may be different today than a century ago, the intrinsic value it delivers to our community has not diminished. As we move beyond 2020 and prepare for the next wave of rail construction, there is an even greater opportunity for the rail industry to make a difference. With this report, we recognise the essential nature of rail and the further benefits it is set to realise in the future. For this morning's event, we will hear from the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development, the Honourable Michael McCormack. Following the Deputy Prime Minister's address, we are very fortunate to be joined live by the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development, the Honourable Catherine King, to provide us with her keynote address on the Labor Party's vision for rail in Australia. We will also have time to ask Catherine questions, and I encourage you to do that following her address. Finally, we will be joined by John O'Mahony from Deloitte Access Economics, the authors of the report, to provide us with an overview of the key findings, analysis and insights detailed in the Value of Rail report. As we progress through this morning's event, you can submit questions for both Catherine and John at any time via the questions pane in the control panel to the right of your screen. We will now hear from our first keynote speaker, the Honourable Michael McCormack, who I am sure is a familiar face to many of you. Michael was first elected to the Federal Parliament in 2010 as the member for Riverina. He has held several ministerial portfolios, including small business, veterans affairs and defence personnel. In 2018, Michael was appointed the leader of the National Party and was promoted to Cabinet as the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Michael was unfortunately called away at the last minute due to a late scheduling change, but he has been able to prepare a video to share with us today. I now invite Cindy to play Michael's video for us all.
Welcome to the launch of the Australasian Railway Association report, Value of Rail. It's a pleasure to be with you today, albeit virtually. I'd also like to, of course, acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet today, and wherever you are, pay tribute to elders past, present and emerging. 2020 is a year like none we have experienced in living memory. And as we head towards Christmas, there may be some in our community who are concerned about Australia's future, but I'm not. I lead a party which has stood the test of time and benefited from the experience. I lead a party which represents rural and regional Australians, and they have been their best selves during what has been, yes, a challenging time, a difficult year. But you know, country people are at their best when the challenges are at their most. The Nationals began 2020, marking our first century as a party. We began just after the Spanish flu outbreak in Australia, and history tells us things will always get better. But we must plan, of course, for this outcome, rather than leave it to chance. This is exactly what our government has done this year. Last month, we released the 2020-21 Commonwealth Budget, which sets out our economic recovery plan for Australia, a blueprint, a vision, an economic plan. And rail will have a vital role in that recovery. We are significant funders of rail infrastructure, and our approach includes commitments to inland rail, urban passenger rail, and faster rail to the regions. By now, you may be used to hearing about inland rail at events such as these. Inland rail is a key piece of the Australian Government's $110 billion 10-year infrastructure investment pipeline and a vital component of the national freight and supply chain strategy. This project is helping regional Australia recover from the economic impact of COVID-19 by delivering jobs now and for many years to come. Up to 16,000 jobs will be supported by inland rail during construction and operation. It is already benefiting our towns where construction is underway, and those workers are out and about in our communities, spending money in our towns and with local suppliers. The first section to be completed, first of 13, Parks to Narromine, is a great example of the benefits to come. More than 1,800 people were employed on this section alone, and almost $110 million, big money, spent with 99 local and regional businesses, including $14.1 million with Indigenous-owned businesses. The next section to begin, construction between Narrabri and North Star, has just received planning approval. Construction will begin shortly. The value of rail for northwest New South Wales will be there for all to see. There are many ways in which inland rail supports jobs and will help our economic recovery. With multi-million-dollar contracts awarded and Australian jobs created at companies such as Rockler in Mittagong, Liberty One Steel in Whyalla, South Australia, and Pandrol in Sydney, the positive benefits of the first section alone have been widely felt. Whether it is the steel workers in Whyalla who supplied Parks to Narromine with 14,000 tonnes of Australian steel rail tracks, or the concrete batches who made 200,000 concrete sleepers in Mittagong, or the $13 million culvert contract at Tamworth, inland rail has been providing jobs for Australians in regions right across our nation. On the longer term value of inland rail, the evidence is also very clear. Modelling from the CSIRO indicates an average transport cost saving of $76 per tonne to be achieved by shifting specific agricultural supply chains from road to inland rail. In March this year, I released an EY Australia report commissioned by the government which looked at the long-term opportunities to come to regional areas once inland rail begins operation. The EY study demonstrates real long-term sustainable employment and investment will be attracted around the operation of inland rail. The report found inland rail will boost regional economies by growing businesses such as manufacturing, packing facilities, food and fibre processing, regional airports and distribution centres. It also found that inland rail could boost gross regional product by $13.3 billion in today's dollars. This is the value added to goods and services over the first half a century and inject up to 2,500 full-time jobs by just the 10th year of operation, and more to come, of course, over the following decades. The COVID-19 crisis has reminded us how vital an efficient freight supply chain is for Australia. Inland rail is an essential part of our national freight network, and the economic stimulus from inland rail's construction will help us to build momentum and recover from this global health crisis. Inland rail will drive the road to rail mode shift needed to increase the safety and efficiency of the national freight network and deliver cost savings for freight customers, including farmers, small businesses and manufacturers. Our commitments also see us investing heavily in urban passenger rail in partnership with the states and territories. In early June, we announced a further injection of $1.75 billion into the Sydney Metro Western Sydney Airport Rail project. This ensures this about $11 billion project will start this year, providing a significant boost during the COVID-19 recovery. This new 23-kilometre metro railway will become the transport spine for Western Sydney by connecting from St Mary's to the Western Sydney Aerotropolis via the Western Sydney International Nancy Bird Walton Airport. We are contributing $5.25 billion, the largest ever investment by an Australian government in a public transport project. Big money, big ideas, getting it done. 5.8 kilometres of extra tunnelling has been designed for the new line, with 6 stations proposed for stage 1. Early construction work is scheduled for later this year to meet our objective of having rail connected to Western Sydney International Airport in time for the grand airport opening. And it will be grand, it's a big project. We are also investing heavily in urban rail in Western Australia. The Australian government has committed $2.3 billion for network shaping Metronet projects. This involves 70 kilometres of new heavy passenger rail and up to 14 new railway stations. It includes our $625 million commitment to the jointly funded Morley-Ellenbrook Line project, which will create jobs, of course, and support economic growth. Now more than ever, it is important to ensure we have the safe and efficient transport connections needed for all Australians, urban and regional, to start moving again. But that's not all. In the 2020-21 budget, we also committed over $102 million towards replacing Perth's existing rail signalling and control systems, which are nearing the end of their asset lives. Our funding will support the planning and procurement for the new automatic train control system, a new public transport operations control centre, and completing the prototype fitment of the first train. I'd list all the rail projects we're investing in, but you'll go to sleep and I don't have time. And in passing, I do want to note a further $208 million in stage 2 of the Warrnambool rail line upgrade and $320 million towards stage 3 of the Shepparton upgrade in this year's budget, and Victorians will be delighted with that. The government backs the value of rail and the evidence is there, with construction occurring across the nation and further commitments front and centre of the budget papers. Faster rail offers a significant opportunity to shift the focus of our population growth away from sprawling major capital cities. We are very focused on delivering faster journey times along strategic corridors which link our major capital cities with key regional hubs. Some of you may recall that we committed $2 billion to progress faster rail from Melbourne to Geelong in the 2019-20 budget. In this year's budget, the Australian government committed an additional $15 million to accelerate faster rail planning from Sydney to Newcastle and $4 million to investigate faster rail from Perth to Bunbury. In total, we have now committed $79 million to investigate faster rail along strategic corridors connecting major capital cities to key regional centres across Queensland, across New South Wales, across Victoria and WA. Our economic recovery plan for Australia is very, very comprehensive. The 2020-21 budget set a new record level of spending on transport infrastructure, $110 billion over the next decade. It includes a significant support for rail, which will play a vital role in our recovery. And I know you're all pretty excited about that, as you should be. I am, and I know you are too. The timetable to build the nation-shaping inland rail is continuing at pace, with a second section to begin construction soon, Narrabri to North Star. Our commitment to urban passenger rail, in partnership with state governments, is unwavering. We will also continue to invest in faster rail projects, with additional funding in the budget. Rail is in the DNA of the party I lead. Who can ever forget the commitment, the enthusiasm of the late, great Tim Fischer? And that enthusiasm is also shared by our coalition partners. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the ARA, to Danny and Caroline for the work you do in advancing rail in this country. It's appreciated, it's acknowledged, it's recognised. Well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister for setting aside time to provide us with that message in what has been an incredibly busy year for the government. The government's investment in rail infrastructure across the country, particularly inland rail, is essential for ensuring that Australia is well positioned to continue operating as the backbone of Australia's transport network. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development, the Honourable Catherine King. Catherine was elected to Parliament in 2001, where she has served as the member of Ballarat for almost 2 decades. A fantastic home to rail in the region of Ballarat. In government, Catherine has held several ministerial positions, including Road Safety and Regional Australia, Local Government and Territories. In opposition, Catherine spent almost 3 years as the Shadow Minister for Health, before also taking on the Medicare portfolio in 2016. Catherine was appointed to her current position in June of last year. I will now hand over to Catherine. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Caroline, and it's a delight to be here with you today as I join you from my office in Ballarat. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I also pay my respects to the traditional custodians of lands on which you are all joining us from far and wide across the country. To the Deputy Prime Minister, who wasn't with us live, but I will acknowledge his presence, to Caroline and your team, and to all of your members joining us here today. It's terrific to be with you, and hopefully soon we will all be gathered in person. Look, today's report from Deloitte on the value of rail tells us what many of us know, and indeed many of the same findings that Deloitte found in 2011 and in 2017, that rail's contribution to our economy and society is significant, that it's underrated and that it's growing. There is a lot to agree with in the report. Rail, of course, is an essential industry. It moves our people around, our freight around in so many ways that we all rely on. It employs over 165,000 Australian workers, and in the future, it has the potential to employ many more. Labor knows this, and we're determined to help the industry thrive and to grow. Like my predecessor in this role, the now Labor leader, Anthony Albanese, I'm determined that rail sits at the forefront when it comes to infrastructure investment in our nation. We do have a proud record in this space. When last in government, we committed more funding to urban public transport than all previous federal governments combined since Federation. And hopefully gone are the days where the federal government thinks that it's not its responsibility to invest in public transport. We invested in the regional rail link in Victoria, the Moreton Bay link in Queensland, and the Seaford Rail extension in South Australia, amongst many others. We began the visionary work for high-speed rail from Melbourne to Brisbane, and we rebuilt a third of the interstate rail network, or 4,000 kilometres of track. When it came to freight, we got to work there too. We invested almost $1 billion in planning and track upgrades for the Inland Rail project, and much of what you're seeing delivered at the moment is part of that $1 billion commitment. We developed a national freight and supply chain strategy and delivered the biggest investment in Australia's freight rail infrastructure in more than a century. In Sydney, we built a new 36-kilometre dedicated line between Macarthur and Chillara, separating freight from passenger trains and trebling the capacity of this vital corridor. We built freight intermodals across the nation, recognising the full importance of rail. We're very proud of the work that we did, but of course there is a lot more to be done. According to the National Freight and Supply Chain Strategy, national freight volumes are projected to grow by over 35% between 2018 and 2040. Over the same period, we're set to see nearly a 60% increase in urban freight. Despite this, productivity has plateaued since the 1990s and too little is being done about it. If we're lucky enough to form government after the next election, we're determined to address some of these issues. While we will announce further policies as we move through this term, we have already made clear that we want to build more rail infrastructure and more rail transport, and we want to build it here, and we want Australians to benefit. I was very pleased to see that this report calls for governments to strengthen opportunities for Australia's domestic manufacturers to compete. And I quote the report where it says, a broad-based view across procurement, skills and commercial arrangements could help ensure Australia's manufacturing sector has appropriate opportunity to participate over the longer term, particularly in regional areas and high-end technology. That is precisely the view that Labor shares, and we've already announced some policy in this area. In delivering the budget reply, the Leader of the Opposition declared that a Labor government would establish an Office of National Rail Industry Coordination within the Department of Industry to undertake a national audit of the adequacy, capacity and condition of passenger trains and develop train priority plans. That we would reinstate the important role of the rail supply advocate cut by the Liberals in 2013 to help small and medium-sized enterprises to identify export opportunities and to get a foot in the door with government purchasing bodies. And of course, to establish a Rail Industry Innovation Council to prevent the loss of more jobs and address the need for more local research and development skills and capability. We were pleased to work with so many of you in the industry in forming that policy. As we are all aware, Australia's state-based rail manufacturing sector is fragmented, inefficient and disconnected, leading to a boom and bust cycle within the industry that hurts workers and businesses. Businesses can't plan for the future when they have no clear idea what will be needed and by when. This flows on to workers who cannot plan their futures, take out mortgages or settle with their family without having to worry that whether their current contract ends in 3 to 5 years, that there might be nothing following. We do have the capacity in this country to change it. The next 2 decades will see significant investment in rail infrastructure across Australia's passenger, freight and light rail networks, with major projects such as Inland Rail, Melbourne and Sydney Metros, Metronet and Cross River Rail, to name a few. A properly planned procurement cycle will help keep costs down and give businesses the certainty that they need. And by manufacturing trains here, Labor's plan would create up to 659 full-time jobs, create a rolling stock export industry and boost Australia's GDP by up to $5 billion. I represent the regional community with a proud train manufacturing history. The Ballarat Rail Yards, now owned by Alstom, have been operating in my community for over a century. I'm pleased to see in this report that Ballarat is still identified as one of Australia's top 10 passenger rail employment clusters. We in the many communities that rely on rail for employment want to keep it that way. Labor's National Rail Manufacturing Plan will ensure the full benefit of this public spending goes towards creating Australian jobs, from laying the rails to manufacturing the trains. To grow this industry and to support Australia's rail workforces, we need to give rail transport the investment priority it deserves and to ensure that as much as possible of every dollar spent on Australian rail transport goes into the hands of Australian workers and to the Australian rail industry. There is, of course, a lot to do. The report correctly identifies that much of the work on harmonisation of national rail standards has stalled and could benefit from greater leadership and a sense of urgency, whether it be safety standards, communications, workforce or our built infrastructure. Technology improvements are getting ahead of harmonisation, and we already had 100 years to catch up on. COVID-19 has of course forced us all to do business very differently. It does provide an opportunity to reflect on whether we are getting our investments in infrastructure right and whether sufficient attention has been paid to the environment and economic benefits of rail for transporting our people and our freight. This is how we're going to improve our cities, our regions and our communities, and how we deliver a much brighter future for Australia's rail industry. I look forward to working with all of you as we continue to develop our policies ahead of the next election. Thank you very much for your time today. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm also very happy to answer questions either via the chat box. I think someone's going to moderate those, but thanks everybody for being online today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Catherine, for taking the time to join us today. The ARA has publicly welcomed the Labor Party's commitment to create a national rail manufacturing plan to support more Australians build trains and strengthen our own supply chains, and also around promotion of technology and innovation for the sector. Just in terms of some obvious questions from your comment, just on that, the ALP is obviously very strong on rail infrastructure investment, and you know, the manufacturing plan was fantastic. But could you just expand a little bit more about that announcement and what your vision is in that space? And particularly, a lot of our members are quite interested in, you know, the chestnut is around local procurement of rail projects.
Yeah, sure. Well, we also announced, obviously, in the budget, or Anthony announced in the budget in reply, a large procurement strategy as well around infrastructure more broadly, not just rail infrastructure, which is about linking the granting of some of these projects to numbers of apprentices and trainees, as well as looking at local procurement opportunities. So there are those two policy areas I'd highlight that are part of what we call a future made in Australia. So, and we'll be adding more to those details. Obviously, from opposition, we have limited resources to develop the finite elements of every single element of policy. What we've done is made the announcement of the three bodies that I outlined in the speech today around the that would sit within the industry portfolio in particular, because they are largely around procurement. But really the issue is, and I've seen it here locally in my own community, is having this large-scale oversight of procurement that we don't have currently. We don't know when projects are coming online in different states. We don't know what the capacity of those state governments to purchase rolling stock is going to be, although we've got an idea about that. We clearly, before COVID, every time we added greater capacity to a rail line through built infrastructure, we underestimated the passenger take-up. It literally had outstripped all projections. And I think getting some consistent and proper way of actually doing that, being able to say nationally, okay, well, Queensland's online next, this is when they're going to be looking at procurement of rolling stock, being able to make that available to manufacturers here to Australia so that they can bid and make that pipeline much more, smooth out that pipeline as much as we possibly can with better data and better information, I think is part of the announcement that we've made.
Absolutely. And one of the other issues that links to that is around innovation and technology development and acceptance here in Australia. And we've just recently released a report that says globally we're not benchmarking particularly well. Do you think there's a way that we can use the plans that you're announcing to further look at that technology and innovation adoption?
Yeah, look, I think that's possible, but I think that also goes into the harmonisation agenda as well. I think that's what we're seeing at the moment, is that the technology is sort of now outstripping as states, quite rightly look at their communications technology, look at the way in which, they're wanting to improve efficiencies across their own systems, that then is outstripping the harmonisation task of trying to make sure we've got that being done across the country. So I think there's a piece of work particularly around harmonisation and where we go with that links to the technology argument as well. But I think, we do want to be, as innovative as we possibly can in improving efficiencies across our freight and rail networks. But what we also want to do is make sure that we've got that harmonisation, because that is a break, I think, definitely in terms of efficiency and productivity as well.
It's interesting. I'm getting a lot of statements supporting what you're saying, as opposed to additional questions here from the audience today. Also, some interesting rivalry about which states gets which money. So obviously, there's a bit of sensitivity about federal investment, which is quite interesting. Just one question to close us out, because I think, two rather. One is the obvious one. There was a great question here about what's your view on faster rail, noting that the government has announced some funding for a study, but obviously it's quite the issue of discussion now that people are allegedly going to be moving out to the regions post-COVID.
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting. I think we are yet to work out where what the impact and implication is of COVID for our cities. Like, is this going to stick? Are people, I look at, it's interesting, I'm hearing different reports. So obviously, as a Victorian, I've seen, the very significant impact that has had on our capital city of Melbourne. Our regions, my own of Ballarat, is experiencing really substantial interest in our housing market. Every time land sales have opened up recently, it's been huge. So we're not keeping up with demand for new housing at the moment. And everyone's saying this is people from the city looking for escape from Melbourne, all of those things happening. And I think that smart regionalisation is really important, but I just don't think we know yet where it's going to land. I think my gut feel is that how it's going to land is we will start to see people going back into the city, but maybe only working maybe 2-3 days a week, maybe staggering their hours a bit to keep social distancing in place for a while. But if you go and talk to cities like Brisbane, it's as though nothing's happened. I don't know what the demand is like on public transport, but it's still people are using different modalities to get to work, I think, and we're certainly seeing that in New South Wales. But equally, we're also seeing people who are saying, well, I don't actually need to work from the office anymore, and it's easier to do that. So I don't think we know yet. All of that means is that I think we've got a little bit of time to think about whether we are getting those investments right, and we need to sort of recalibrate with state governments about what that looks like. But I am a strong believer that and I talk about smart regionalisation, I don't talk about decentralisation. What I talk about is that our regions are growing already. They're growing in a way that we should be able to look at how we improve the infrastructure, whether it's communications infrastructure, whether it's social infrastructure in schools and health facilities, at the same time as we're contemplating improving rail infrastructure. The government's got a lot of business cases that it's facilitating for faster rail. The challenge, I think, in each of those is going to be, so for example, the Geelong one is they are billions and billions of dollars of investment, and we just don't know yet, like everyone wants it, but whether it's in fact actually going to be as cost effective. It's certainly going to be more than $2 billion, the one from, which is the money the government's put in, the one from Geelong. So I think we've got a little bit of time, but I think we need to get, basically the government needs to get a wriggle on to really, really say if it's going to do this, then it needs to be doing it in a way that is, that is actually going to happen, and not make big promises about things and really not actually deliver on them. I think it's important that if it is going to do it, then it needs to actually get on with it and do them.
Just to finish, one of the other areas that has been heavily impacted as a result of COVID is our rail freight sector, and I certainly think at no point have we ever had the community so aware of how critical freight is generally, but obviously rail freight played a critical role. I'd just be interested in your views about the rail freight sector. Obviously, from the Coalition's perspective, Inland Rail is a big project and quite the centre point, but obviously our rail freight network is a national one, and there are a number of issues for that sector as well.
Again, I think I would hate to think the focus and attention just on inland rail means that we're dropping the ball across the board. I think it is timely to perhaps have a look again back at the National Rail Freight Strategy to see whether it is the recommendations in that remain fit for purpose, or whether there is definitely unfinished business that was part of that. But I think it also links very strongly to our national, the National Ports Strategy. So again, the government with Inland Rail has got a challenge on its hands about how that connectivity to the Port of Brisbane in particular, that's where they really need to start. I know they've put some money in the recent budget about trying to resolve some of those issues, but again, I think there needs to be some certainty around that. Victoria, the same, whether it's the Port of Melbourne or whether there's some other calibration the government ends up with, I think that's important. But I think, again, it is really about how the entire freight task across coastal shipping, across rail and across road, and what the mix is at the moment, and have we got that right? And particularly where COVID showed, there were vulnerabilities. I think that's, worthy of a piece of work that, I hope the government would start to do sooner rather than later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I think we could talk for about another, hour on all of the issues, but we might park that and do that at another time, because I know our members would certainly value hearing your thoughts on a lot of these issues. So thank you very much. We really appreciate your time today.
Terrific. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And now to the report and the findings. So the Value of Rail report was delivered by Deloitte Access Economics and includes in-depth analysis of the Australian rail industry. To help us outline the key findings, we're now joined by the report's author, John O'Mahony. John is a partner of Deloitte and specialises in digital trends, innovation and the public sector. He's previously served as Senior Economic Advisor to two Australian Prime Ministers, where he had specific responsibility for communications, infrastructure and innovation policies. He's also worked for the Australian Financial Review, the New South Wales Government and the University of Sydney's Faculty of Economics and Business. John is also the co-author of two of Australia's best-selling high school economics textbooks. So your children might well be reading John's work as well, on the global economy and the market economy. Welcome, John. I'll let you now present the report. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Caroline, and welcome to everybody who's on the line this morning and this afternoon. Wonderful to be here to present one of the longest running pieces of research that Deloitte's done now for almost a decade on the value of rail. Whenever we get the opportunity to study the sector, to present infrastructure conferences, we know it's very important to the economy. So it's a real pleasure for us, especially in 2020. It's been a very, very significant year for rail, both in economic and in policy terms. The Deputy Prime Minister mentioned the National Rail Action Plan. We know what it has to say about skills and about harmonisation and the policy agenda, and also there from the opposition as well, rail manufacturing, what that might mean for Australia's future as well. I've also noticed a big uptick in the ARA's activity in 2020. I know a lot of that goes to Caroline Wilkie herself, pushing the agenda for the sector, which he has to do, and making sure it's recognised in our overall accounts as well. Just over on the second slide this morning there, we've got the update on the changing face of rail over the last decade with our different reports. We recognise that rail is a very important business in Australia. Australia has 900 businesses in the rail industry. And as Caroline mentioned, it's broadly divided between passenger, freight, and construction industries, with a small component as well for manufacturing. A complex ecosystem where obviously, you know, prices and deals demonstrate the value that the sector plays. But this report, the value of rail, is about how rail is more than just a business. It has a bigger dividend for our economy, for our society, and for the environment as well. The value of rail report shows that rail is not just a business, it is a much bigger part of our lives. And this report is about that bigger picture. It's a report that does analysis over the last few years and shows how rail has changed, and has some commentary about what has happened in the COVID-19 era as well. But I would just caveat up front that there is a lot of uncertainty about the impact of COVID-19 on rail, and the analysis largely predates the impact of COVID-19. Where to begin, but with that context, over on the next slide, we've got every economist's favourite chart for 2020, and that is our GDP, our overall economic performance, and you know, even if you had both eyes closed, you could spot 2020 on the chart there. It's of course the most significant economic downturn in decades, losing 7% of our GDP. I look back at the time when I was in Canberra around 2009, 2010. I mean, sheesh, you can hardly even spot the downturn caused by the global financial crisis compared with what policymakers and businesses have faced this year. It's also a downturn that's greatly affected some sectors more than others. So obviously, if you're in the healthcare sector or in finance sector, those sectors, of course, have been growing very strongly during this year, whereas other sectors like arts and recreation, hospitality, they have been very negatively affected. The rail industry really is a tale of two sides. In that the freight rail industry has grown very strongly through this year, but the passenger rail system has obviously been greatly down in terms of passengers because of COVID-19, social distancing, and government regulations or instructions around where people are allowed to travel. Sydney, where I'm from, is the figures I'm familiar with, and I know that the daily rail passenger movements have fallen from something like 35 million per day pre-COVID to down to 5 million per day at the peak of the pandemic, and have only since recovered to around 15 million per day. So there's a fair way to go before rail is back on track. But it is a sector, as the next slide demonstrates, that's going to be very important in the next year or two in Australia as we try to get out of this recession and build economic strength. Rail has already played a very important role in driving our GDP in recent years. The Northwest Metro in Sydney, Dandenong Rail in Melbourne, Moreton Bay up in Queensland. We know these projects have been important. And then the next couple of years, In addition to inland rail, there are these city-based projects as well, Sydney Metro, Melbourne Metro, that are going to, Cross River Rail up in Brisbane, that are going to play a really important role as well in getting the economy back on track. But just over on the next slide, we've got what our forecasts look like prior to COVID-19. It's pretty easy to stand next to that freight rail forecast of 24%. Over the next few years. These are the 5-year forecasts from 2000. Sorry, the 6-year forecast from 2020. It's easy to stand next to the freight rail forecast. That, of course, has been growing very strongly, and with iron ore prices above $100 a ton, you'd expect that's going to be strong too. A big driver of growth, but passenger rail is going to be the difficult one to predict in the next few years. The longer term trend for passenger rail should be strong, but it will be affected by COVID-19. There's been a lot of debate in the last couple of months about what our cities will look like in the post-COVID-19 period. Are we likely to see an increase in working from home or working from suburbs? Is this likely to impact our passenger rail networks? So that is likely to affect the forecast for the future. Over on the next slide, we can get into some of the nuts and bolts about the economic, social, and environmental benefits of rail. And when you hear these figures, I think you'll be convinced that policy should be finding a way for rail to play a bigger role in both passenger and in freight terms, and make sure that the sector does recover strongly from COVID-19. This is the first dividend. This is the economic impact of the rail industry. And it's split up into what economists call the direct economic impact and the indirect economic impact. So the direct economic impact looks at rail businesses themselves and says, well, what capital, what labour are they using to generate economic activity? But we also know that in a complex ecosystem with big supply chain like rail, it also has an indirect or multiplied impact on the economy, because those rail businesses spend on other businesses in property, finance, engineering elsewhere, and that itself, those other businesses also drive economic activity through their use of labour and capital in the economy. All up, it's an industry worth $30 billion a year to Australia's national GDP, and it's up 14% since 2015-16, a very strongly growing industry. It's also up significantly in employment terms. I could talk you through all the numbers that are down the bottom there, or over on the next slide, to help you visualize it, I'd give you this one-liner. If the rail industry was a single organisation, it'd be the 3rd largest employer in Australia. Now, obviously, it's not a single organisation. It's hundreds of businesses. But if they were all one organisation called Railcorp Australia, Rail Corporation Australia, it'd be the 3rd largest employer in this country. There are a lot of people whose livelihoods depend on this sector, the jobs created by the businesses. That's what's happening directly and indirectly. Of course, that's not capturing all of the benefits that flow to the passengers themselves. I mean, you think of all the people whose jobs simply wouldn't be possible if they weren't able to commute by rail. So it's a very significant economic contribution. And while it's important nationally, over on the next slide, we also highlight that it's a very important role that it plays regionally as well. Picture here of the top 10 rail freight employment clusters in Australia. Gladstone, Mackay, Newcastle, Rocky, all having a very significant rail freight employment cluster. All up, 55%, it's more than half of the jobs in rail freight in regional Australia. That is something for the industry to be very proud of. Most industries would at least follow the national population, have a lot of jobs in cities, or some can even be dominated by city employment. But the rail freight sector, very important for regional Australia. So that's our economic dividend. And now I'd like to switch over to the social and environmental dividend, looking firstly at passenger and then at freight rail. Over on the next slide, we've got what I might call the money slide. if you were to walk away from today with nothing but a sense of being tortured by too many slides and too many statistics, if you were to take away one, I would commend this to you. This is the slide that tells that broader environmental and social story for firstly passenger rail, and we'll talk about freight in a moment as well. You can see some of the benefits here of shifting people from road transport, from private motor vehicles across to passenger rail. We don't say all that to beat up on cars or on road transport, but it's a way of visualizing what is the benefit of passenger rail. The benefit of a 20% increase in rail passengers each year, a number of benefits. The first one is the carbon emissions savings. Obviously, people that are on electrified rail systems are jumping out of gasoline, mostly gasoline powered cars, and that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It helps Australia achieve its targets, and it can have a quantifiable benefit for the economy as well, as long as you're appropriately pricing carbon, which we're not yet in this country, but we do know that projects can already be assessed based on these carbon emission savings. There are also other emissions benefits. One measure of that is particulate matter benefits. The problem with this particulate matter, whether it's coarse or whether it's really small particulate matter, is if that's in the air, that can get into people's lungs and can cause respiratory problems. I know that petrol and diesel makers, do their own best to try to reduce that emissions, but we do know that rail does a better job. That as well can flow through to health benefits for the citizenry as well. But if you total up the biggest impacts, you see a couple of them below. The congestion savings from passenger rail are astounding. Obviously, having fewer cars on the road means less people in traffic jams, and means that people can get to work on time, they can get home on time. And I think if you ask most people what they could do to improve their life on a weekly basis, having less congestion is really high up there. I have read a study once about what could make people happier. I think the two things that people most wanted to avoid was their morning commute in the car and their afternoon commute in the car. So maybe there's some frustration benefits that aren't captured by the figures here, but there are ways of measuring the congestion savings through the time travel reductions that can be quantified here in the hundreds of millions of dollars of benefits. There's also crash cost savings. I used to work at the RTA here in New South Wales. I remember being surprised by the use of the crash cost language. I remember asking, why don't we call them accidents? And the answer, the bureaucratic answer was, of course, that we don't know that they're accidental. So that's why they use the crash cost terminology. But I did see there that the crash costs from motor vehicle accidents are very significant and obviously hugely traumatic for people as well. We've got two different measures which we use in the report to try to capture these costs. There's something called the human capital cost, another one, the willingness to pay cost. But alongside the attempts to quantify this, there's obviously the huge traumatic suffering impacts which can come from motor vehicle accidents. Obviously, with rail's safety record, it means that there can be a benefit in shifting people from one mode to another. And the final one there reminds me of walking up and down the hill towards Beverly Hills Station. As a schoolboy, I'm actually walking to the station now as well. Something that keeps you fit is the walking benefits that come from passenger rail as well. People, the incidental walking that happens when people are on passenger rail improves their health and adds up to the health benefit there as well. All up, it's a very significant dividend. $15 per trip, $1.2 billion per year that could be added to Australia's overall welfare with this type of modal shift. So these are similar figures to what we've produced previously, but they're broader and they're up to date for the latest edition of the report. So I commend them to you very strongly. Even with all these figures, there are some aspects that we're not able to quantify. Just over on the next slide, we've got one more message for you for passenger rail, and that is that rail is a socially inclusive mode of transport as well. I think social inclusivity and being around other people may not be a very popular sentiment during the middle of a pandemic, but hopefully that changes in 2021 and beyond. And what I mean by this is just over on the next slide, where we looked at commuters in capital cities and specifically for CBD bound journeys, finding that passenger transport, passenger rail was the most popular mode of CBD bound travellers, particularly for those with long commutes. It's the most used mode of commuters for people who need assistance. It helps move more low-income commuters than any other mode and is the highest share among women under 30 as well. So it's another story for the rail industry, that stepping onto a train is a slice of life in Australia, where you'll see people in suits and ties, people who need assistance, people who be pushing prams. It really is a mode of transport where everybody can be on it. It's an egalitarian mode of transport, and that's an important story as well as we think about the broader social dividend of the sector. The other side is the freight slide, the freight side of things, and that's over on the next slide, where we've got some figures about the benefits of freight rail as well. And overall, it's a 1% shift in modal share from road to rail generates a $72 million annual benefit to the economy through similar safety, environmental, and health benefits to the passenger sector that I discussed earlier. We've got a few case studies of how this operates in the report. I know Pilbara Rail is given a description in there. Talk about inland rail, but also some of the challenges in getting it right. We talk about the Eyre Peninsula and grain rail in South Australia, and how if there are any problems with the complexity of the ecosystem, then you can see a shift in the other direction. That's why I've seen both the government and the opposition trying to rejuvenate efforts to support the sector. What does rejuvenation look like? The final slide is next, just covering some of our policy priorities. Getting the investment decision right means making sure at the business case stage that we take into account all of these broader social and environmental benefits of rail and costs of road when assessing different projects. Our policymakers already try to do this. The point from this report is this could be done better, because at the moment the figures are dated and don't include all of the environmental and social benefits. It's getting the price right for businesses and for commuters as well. Just to take one example of congestion, where a person jumping into a car doesn't face a cost of congestion other than having to wait, but doesn't face a price signal on that. Whereas obviously people who are jumping on rail are generating a benefit and don't receive any direct benefit for that. It's strengthening opportunities for Australia's domestic manufacturers to compete. Having the right skills, having the right procurement processes for that are incredibly important. There's two other items that have already been mentioned today, so I won't go into detail on them. It's the harmonisation agenda that the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned, and finally, the important role that technology will play for the future of rail in Australia, passenger and freight. It's the use of Internet of Things technology, mobile technology, artificial intelligence, how this can make our networks run more efficiently, how it can provide more information to rail freight businesses and also to passengers to make rail more attractive. I know that the ARA recently published a paper with the assistance of LEK Consulting that canvassed a lot of these items in detail, so I won't go over them again today, but I think it's a very exciting opportunity for Australia's innovation agenda for us to have more technology built into our rail system and to make the system work better. And I say all that recognising that rail doesn't operate in isolation. It's competing against other modes of transport in a constantly changing economy, and road won't be standing still either. Obviously, it's adopting a lot more technology as well. So it's very important that policy and industry, government and industry work together to make sure that technology is embedded into the next wave of rail in this country. Commend the report to you. It's available on the ARA website from today. Caroline suggested to me earlier that it might be front page of the newspapers tomorrow after some media today. But if not, if you get an opportunity to pass it on to people in the sector or beyond, it is a great way of telling the story of the rail industry. So I think we're going to wrap it there, Caroline. We might see if there's one or two questions about the research and what it means for the sector.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much for that presentation and all your hard work on this. I think I said I'm not sure that we will get on the front page of the paper rather than that we will. Certainly, I mean, for all of us in the industry, this is a fascinating report, but probably not quite news breaking as some of the other issues at the moment. One of the issues I just wanted to ask you was more for interest. Obviously, you've worked on this report. We did one 4 years ago. Is there anything that stood out from this report in terms of changes or anything that you thought, oh, wow, that's actually quite interesting?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the freight rail story is very significant. It's how important it will be for Australia's export success into the future. So we've got to focus on that in this research report. Obviously, rail is the backbone of both the coal industry and the iron ore industry. I mean, they are Australia's two largest exports. And I know the Deputy Prime Minister, this is an agenda close to the Deputy Prime Minister's heart. As we diversify our exports, particularly in the growth of agriculture and our exports to Asia, rail playing a really important role in that will be important for the sector's future. So I think that export story was one that really stood out to me in the 2020 edition.
Wonderful. And obviously the curly question that we all don't know at the moment, which is what the impact of COVID will have. Now, this report is interesting because it's pre-COVID, and I'm very conscious of the fact that, you know, a lot of the discussion now is around, you know, we have a huge pipeline of investment planned. Well, what does it mean if people don't come back to public transport or don't come back to public transport the way that we thought that they would? Do you have any thoughts on that, given, you know, your intimate knowledge of all of the stats in this report?
Yeah, I mean, look, the one contribution I'd make about the work from home agenda is that I think CBDs will be more resilient than what they're given credit for at the moment. I know that CBDs look relatively quiet at the moment, but I think once we have a vaccine for COVID-19 and people have the opportunity to work in cities, I can see a CBD revival happening after that. And I say that as someone who's had to make forecasts about telework and people working from home for the last 10 or 20 years. And I know that whenever we forecast those changes, they haven't happened. Now, obviously, this year, people have been effectively banned from going into CBDs, either by governments or by their businesses. But I think once that opens up, I think that cities are going to be very popular places to be, because if people aren't banned from going there, people really like going in to socialise, collaborate, meet people at work, and that could take some time to come back. But I would imagine in 2 or 3 years' time, we could see that our CBDs are very strongly growing areas, and rail is going to play a very important part in that.
Absolutely, and I hope you're right when we do this again in 4 years' time. So John, thank you so much for your presentation today. That brings us to the end of our launch today. All of the reports are available on the ARA website, and you may have also received an email today with all of the details. This year we have not only the report, but also a number of specific fact sheets about different sectors, so that if you have a particular sector you're interested in, you can see those stats. As you can appreciate, if you start reading the report, there's almost, you know, 5 facts on every page. So we are also preparing a document that has every fact pulled out, because I do think this will be incredibly valuable for people making tender submissions, broader policy submissions, or promoting the sector more widely. So that will also come in time. I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister, the Honourable Michael McCormack, and Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development, Catherine King, for generously sharing their time with us today. And of course, thank you, John, for all of your time and the expertise of Deloitte Access Economics for this report. In terms of today's event, I hope you found it informative. If you have any further questions, please do get in touch and we can assist you. Our next major event, believe it or not, it's November, is going to be Ausrail, which is just over 2 weeks away. A number of the themes raised today in our conversation will be on the program. So if you haven't already registered, I do encourage you to do so. There are also a number of social events. So for those of you who are keen to get out and about and see each other, we have the perfect event for you to come and talk all things rail. So I do hope to see you there. Thank you again for joining us, and I do hope you find this report of value. Thank you and have a lovely rest of your day.